The scent of polished leather and fresh coffee lingered in the air as the glass doors of Redmond Prestige Motors slid open. A man stepped inside, his jeans slightly faded, his boots worn from years of hard work. His jacket, though clean, lacked the luxury labels that adorned the usual clientele. Salesman after salesman threw him indifferent glances before turning back to their phones or their high-profile customers. But then, the manager, Greg Hudson, spotted him. Greg was a man who prided himself on judging a customer at first glance. And this man? He screamed, "Waste of time." Still, with a smirk, Greg strolled over, fixing his expensive Rolex as he crossed the showroom. He glanced at the man's clothes, then at the gleaming, high-end sports cars surrounding them, and let out a chuckle. "You lost, buddy?" he asked, voice dripping with condescension. The man, calm and composed, ignored the insult. His gaze settled on a sleek, jet-black Lamborghini Huracan at the center of the showroom. He ran his fingers over its flawless exterior. "This one. I like it." Greg barely contained his laughter. "Oh, this was going to be good." "You like it?" Greg repeated mockingly. "Great taste, but this isn't a museum. You actually need money to drive it off the lot." A few of the other employees chuckled nearby. One even shook his head in amusement. The man looked at Greg, his eyes cool and unreadable. "Don't worry about my money," he said quietly. "Just tell me the price." Greg rolled his eyes. Another dreamer. "Listen, pal," he said, slapping a hand on the car's hood. "That thing costs more than your house. Now, I don't have all day, so how about you?" He gestured toward the exit. "Take a walk." The room fell silent. Even the chuckles faded. The man exhaled slowly, taking one last glance at the Lamborghini before turning away. He strolled toward the exit without another word. Greg smirked, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. As the glass doors closed behind him, David Carter stopped on the sidewalk in front of the dealership. He looked at his reflection in the massive windows. Just an ordinary man in jeans and a jacket, the kind of man who had just been thrown out. But there was no anger in his eyes, only cold calculation. He was not the man Greg Hudson thought he was. David had been born and raised in a small town where every dollar had to be earned through sheer hard work. His family had struggled financially, and from a young age, he knew that if he wanted a different life, he had to build it himself. Working construction by day and studying business at night, he built his own construction company from scratch. At first, he handled small projects. Then, he started constructing houses. Eventually, he was developing massive commercial properties. His company, Carter Developments, was now worth millions. But David never flaunted his success. He didn't wear expensive suits. He didn't buy flashy watches. He lived simply, without arrogance. And that was Greg Hudson's mistake. A dealership drowning in debt. David had first heard about Redmond Prestige Motors a few weeks ago when his financial advisor presented him with a list of potential businesses to invest in. This dealership had a terrible reputation, poor management. Greg Hudson was an ineffective leader, more concerned with his own image than with customers. Declining sales. Wealthy buyers were choosing competitors because of bad customer service. Massive debt. The dealership's owner, an aging businessman named Robert Phelps, was tired of the problems and looking for a buyer. David had doubted whether it was worth investing in a company that was practically sinking. But after today's incident, he had no more doubts. He would buy the dealership, and he would enjoy every second of it. The decision is made. David pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Mark, it's me." Mark Bennett, his lawyer, was the man who cleaned up every business David invested in. "David, what's going on?" "Let's buy a dealership. Redmond Prestige Motors." Mark paused for a few seconds. "Are you serious? You said you weren't sure about it." David smirked, once again looking through the huge windows of the dealership. Inside, Greg was still joking with his colleagues, completely unaware that he had just lost the biggest game of his life. "I changed my mind. I want it, and I want it fast." Inside the dealership, while David was making the decision to buy the dealership, Greg Hudson was still enjoying his moment. "These guys who think they can just walk in and buy a car crack me up, don't they?" He laughed, shaking his head. Does he even know how much that Lamborghini costs? Another salesman smirked. Maybe he had a plan. Walk in, touch the car, imagine it's his, and walk out. Nothing wrong with dreaming. Greg laughed along with his coworkers, completely unaware that in just 24 hours, he'd be begging for his job. Escalating tension the next morning, Redmond Prestige Motors opened its doors as usual. Salesmen in their sharp suits strolled in, coffee cups in hand, already discussing potential high-profile clients. Greg Hudson arrived last, as always. He never needed to be on time. He was the manager. After all, he ran the place. Or so he thought. When he stepped into his glass-walled office, he immediately noticed something was off. The dealership's owner, Robert Phelps, was seated in one of the visitor chairs, looking strangely relieved. Beside him stood a man Greg didn't recognize at first. Then, their eyes met. Greg's smug grin faltered. It was him, the nobody he had laughed at yesterday. Only now, he wasn't wearing his worn-out jacket. Today, he was in a tailored suit, sharp and commanding. And he wasn't alone. Two men in suits stood behind him, briefcases in hand. "Morning, Greg," Phelps said, exhaling deeply as if a massive weight had been lifted off his shoulders. "Meet your new boss." Greg blinked. "My what?" David Carter extended a hand. David Carter, owner of Carter Developments. And as of last night, the new owner of Redmond Prestige Motors. Greg didn't move. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His brain struggled to process the words. David smiled. "I believe we met yesterday." The moment of reckoning silence crushed the room. Greg's usual arrogance cracked under the weight of the situation. "Wait," Greg scoffed, trying to regain control. "Is this a joke?" He turned to Phelps. "You sold the dealership to him?" Phelps nodded. "The deal was finalized last night. Carter Developments now owns 100% of Redmond Prestige Motors. I signed the papers myself." Greg's face drained of color. "That's impossible." David chuckled. "Is it? Because I'm standing in your office." Greg swallowed hard. He had spent years looking down on nobodies, on men who didn't wear designer suits, on customers who didn't look rich enough. And now, one of those men owned everything. "Don't take it personally," David said, folding his arms. "I was already considering buying this place before I walked in yesterday." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "But your attitude? That sealed the deal." Greg finally realized he had humiliated the wrong man. Power shift. David turned to Phelps. "I appreciate the smooth transition," he said. "We'll begin restructuring today." Greg snapped out of his trance. Wait. He let out a forced laugh. "You don't know how to run a luxury dealership." "You," David cut him off with a stare. "I know how to run a business," he said calmly. "And I know bad leadership when I see it." Greg's fists clenched. "Are you firing me?" David exhaled. "Not yet, but I am making changes." He gestured to one of his lawyers. "Effective immediately, the sales team will be restructured. And customer service? That's getting a complete overhaul." Greg's pulse pounded in his ears. He had never been in this position before. Losing control, being powerless. And the worst part? The man he laughed at was the one pulling the strings. The turning point. By noon, the entire dealership had heard the news. Salesmen whispered in groups, shocked by what had happened. Employees who had witnessed Greg's arrogance for years now watched as he struggled to hold onto his authority. Greg tried to act like nothing had changed, barking orders at the staff, but no one listened. They knew the truth. David Carter wasn't just some guy off the street. He was their new boss. And by the end of the day, Greg Hudson would realize just how much his world had changed. The final blow. By the end of the day, the atmosphere inside Redmond Prestige Motors was electric. Everyone knew something big had happened. The once untouchable Greg Hudson, the man who strutted through the dealership like he owned the place, was nowhere to be seen on the showroom floor. No smug grin, no dismissive glances. He was in his glass-walled office, trapped in silence. The employees felt it. The shift in power. Greg had spent years controlling this dealership with his arrogance. He dictated who was important and who wasn't. If he decided someone was a waste of time, then that was that. Yesterday, he thought he had one. Today, he was sitting at his desk, staring at a future that no longer belonged to him. A sharp knock at the door made him jolt upright. Before he could even respond, the door swung open. David Carter walked in, exuding quiet authority. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Mark Bennett, his lawyer, and two senior advisors from Carter Developments. One of them held a folder filled with documents. Greg tensed. His gut told him exactly what this was. "Greg," David said, stepping forward, his tone calm but firm. "Let's talk about your future." Greg forced himself to sit straighter, trying to keep his authority intact. "You listen to me, Carter." David lifted a hand, and Greg stopped talking. "No need for formalities," David said, his voice controlled. "We both know where this is going." Greg felt his pulse hammering in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one in control. David placed a single document on the desk and slid it forward. Greg looked down. A termination notice. His body tensed. His fingers curled into fists. You can't be serious," Greg stammered, his voice betraying his nerves. "I've been running this place for years. I built this dealership's reputation. You can't just walk in here and—" David tilted his head slightly. "Reputation?" he asked, his expression unreadable. "You mean the one where customers are treated like dirt? Where employees walk around fearing their boss?" Greg's lips pressed together. David leaned forward. "You had a choice yesterday, Greg," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "You had a chance to treat someone with respect, to do your job right." David's eyes locked onto Greg's, unwavering. "And what did you do?" Greg looked away. "You laughed in my face." Silence filled the room. David leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "I'm not firing you for revenge, Greg," he continued. "I'm firing you because you don't belong here anymore." Greg's jaw clenched. He had spent his whole career being the one who decided who was worthy. And now, he was the one being discarded. David tapped the termination notice. "I'm offering you a severance package," he said. "More than fair, considering the damage you've done." Greg looked at the paper. His fingers trembled. "If you don't sign it," David continued, "security will escort you out." Greg gritted his teeth. He had no choice. Slowly, he reached for the pen. With every ounce of pride crushed, he signed the papers. It was over. Greg Hudson was finished. A new era begins. By the next morning, Greg Hudson was gone. His office had been cleared out, his nameplate removed. For the first time in years, employees walked into work without fear. David wasted no time. That morning, he gathered every single employee in the showroom. He didn't stand above them. He didn't act like a king addressing his servants. He stood with them. "I know what kind of place this has been," he said, looking around. "I know it hasn't been easy working under bad leadership." His gaze moved across the faces in the room. Some were skeptical, some hopeful, some still processing what had happened. "But that ends today," David continued. The room fell silent. "I don't care where you come from," he said. "I don't care what you wear, how much money you have, or what car you drive. If you're here, you deserve respect." A shift rippled through the crowd. Some people exhaled deeply, as if releasing years of tension. Others nodded slowly, letting the words settle in. David continued, his voice steady. "Customers, employees, it doesn't matter. We treat people with dignity. That's how we'll run this business." It wasn't a flashy speech, but it was real. And in a place that had been ruled by arrogance and intimidation for so long, it was exactly what they needed. The transformation in the weeks that followed, Redmond Prestige Motors underwent a complete transformation. The toxic culture? Gone. Employees who had been afraid to speak up now thrived. Customer service? Overhauled. No more dismissive attitudes. No more turning away customers based on appearance. Word spread fast. People who had once avoided the dealership started coming back. Sales skyrocketed. And for the first time in years, employees felt proud to work there. Then, one day, an older gentleman walked into the showroom. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, the kind of outfit Greg Hudson would have scoffed at. A young salesman, one of the newest employees, walked up to him with a genuine smile. "Welcome to Redmond Prestige Motors," he said. "Can I help you find something?" The man nodded. "Yeah, I'm looking for something special." They walked to the showroom floor. After a moment of browsing, the man placed his hand on a sleek, jet-black Lamborghini Huracan, the same car David Carter had admired on the day Greg Hudson had humiliated him. The man ran his fingers over the hood, his eyes full of appreciation. "I like this one," he said. The young salesman didn't laugh. He didn't roll his eyes. He simply smiled. "Great choice," he said. "Let's talk numbers." The lesson: David Carter didn't just buy a dealership. He transformed it. He proved that respect isn't about appearances. It's about actions. And those who fail to see that always learn the hard way.